Isabella Ramirez stepped through the threshold of the Collins mansion for the first time in March of 2023. Phoenix greeted her with scalding wind and blinding sun, but the coolness of the marble hallway instantly enveloped her body, making her shiver from the contrasting temperatures. David, her fiancé, proudly displayed the family nest: massive columns, a mahogany spiral staircase, antique furniture, and heavy-framed paintings. That was when she first saw James Collins. A tall man in an impeccable suit was coming down the stairs, and his appearance somehow made Isabella catch her breath. Steely eyes, strong chin, graying temples, he exuded that special authority that his son lacked. The wedding was lavish. Guests came from all over Arizona. The press wrote about the union of construction magnate James Collins and Mexican Beauty Week Isabella, with her swarthy skin and pitch-black hair, seemed like an exotic flower in a garden of white roses. No one mentioned that the bride was the daughter of a simple diner owner from Tijuana. Collins knew how to keep inconvenient facts behind 7 seals. David idolized his wife, showered with gifts, took to resorts. Acquainted with the right people, Isabella learned to wear pearls, play golf, and support small talk. But something subtly gnawed at her from within, perhaps a sense of inferiority, or a longing for a simple life where tequila flowed and music played until dawn. James often kept her company when David was away at construction sites or business meetings. They could talk for hours in the library. Her father-in-law spoke perfect Spanish and knew the history of Mexico better than Isabella herself. He talked about his travels, about his late wife, about art and politics. In his company, Isabella felt intelligent and important. In the summer of 24 years in Phoenix, the heat was unbearable. The hot air melted the asphalt, and the mountains on the horizon trembled in the haze. David was increasingly late at work. The company took a contract to build a huge shopping center. Isabella spent evenings by the pool, sipping cocktails and listening to James's stories. One day he touched her shoulder, shaking off a fallen leaf. The simple touch sent an electric shock through both of them. They froze, staring into each other's eyes, and then recoiled as if burned. Since that day, something subtly changed in their relationship. Isabella began to notice how long her father-in-law's gaze lingered on her figure when she came out of the pool. The way he looked for any excuse for a casual touch. How his voice changed when they were alone together. She catches herself purposely wearing more revealing dresses for dinner and using that perfume he once praised. James owned a small house an hour outside of town. A place for privacy and work, he explained. He'd shown it to Isabella on one of their trips to look at land for a new development. The house was immersed in greenery, with mountains in the distance. Inside, it was in perfect order, minimalist furniture, huge windows, silence. "I feel free here," James said then, and there was a longing in his voice that made Isabella's heart ache. She realized that behind the mask of a successful businessman was a lonely man whose life consisted of endless obligations and conformity to other people's expectations. David was hardly ever home. He rarely called, talking mostly about work. He seemed to be turning more and more into his own father, obsessed with business, obsessed with success. But unlike James, he lacked that inner depth, that magnetism that so attracted Isabella. She began to catch herself in unwelcome thoughts, imagining James kissing her, his strong hands gripping her waist. Then she berated herself for these fantasies, prayed in the home chapel, begged forgiveness at the picture of David's mother. But the desire grew, fueled by loneliness and heat that turned blood into fiery lava. There was a new maid at the mansion, Maria, an elderly Mexican woman with a tenacious gaze and pinched lips. She looked at Isabella with ill-concealed condemnation, as if she already knew what sin was ripening in the young mistress's soul. Her presence unnerved her, made her feel guilty for thoughts that had not yet translated into action. The denouement came on one of those stuffy evenings when the air thickens with tension before a thunderstorm. David had left for a conference in Chicago. James and Isabella sat on the patio, sipping cold wine. The silence between them rang with unspoken words. And then their hands met on the table and the world turned upside down. Their first intimacy had happened at James's country home. Secret meetings required extreme caution. Phoenix was too young for this kind of secrets. Every Tuesday, Isabella supposedly traveled to charity meetings at a local church, while James was away, working on a new project. The house became their sanctuary. Isabella brought her favorite spices there and cooked spicy Mexican dishes. James learned how to drink tequila properly, without lime and salt, slowly savoring each sip. They listened to old records, danced to Nat King Cole, forgetting the age difference and the taboo nature of their connection. Passion intertwined with guilt. Sometimes, lying in James's arms, Isabella cried. He kissed her tears, whispering that he'd never felt like this before, not even for his late wife. At such moments, reality seemed to bifurcate. There was the world of their love and the world of duty they were betraying. David lingered in the office more and more often. The new project had consumed him completely. He had lost weight, shadows under his eyes. Isabella cooked him dinners that went cold, untouched. One day she found an empty bottle of sleeping pills in his jacket. An attempt to talk about it ended with an irritated, "I don't have time for nonsense!" James noticed the change in his son too. "He's repeating my mistakes," he told Isabella. "I was obsessed with work too, until I lost Elizabeth." He never gave details about his wife's death, only that she'd died of cancer 15 years ago. Old photographs of the beautiful, blonde-haired woman were kept in albums that no one ever opened. Their secret was almost discovered by Maria. One morning, she brought Isabella a scarf she had forgotten at the country house. Her eyes were full of understanding and judgment. "Señora, you are playing with fire," was all she said. After this incident, Isabella insisted on dismissing the maid, making up a story about the missing jewelry. Toward the end of the summer, their meetings became more frequent. David suddenly decided to open a branch office in San Diego and spent 3 or 4 days a week there. James and Isabella became increasingly reckless. They took risks, appearing together in restaurants in the neighboring town, walking in the park, holding hands. Love clouded their minds. Isabella felt herself changing. She no longer felt guilt toward David, only a muffled irritation at his perpetual absence and obsession with work. James filled the emptiness that had always lived in her soul. With him, she could be herself, passionate, alive, real. In early September, David unexpectedly returned from San Diego a day early. Isabella barely had time to think of an explanation for his absence from home. He seemed strangely pensive, almost absent-minded. "I miss you," he said for the first time in a long time. That night they made love, but Isabella imagined other hands on her body. The next day, James noticed himself being followed. An unremarkable gray sedan caught his eye several times on his way to the country house. He and Isabella decided to take a break, not seeing each other for a few weeks to put any suspicions to rest. This separation was agonizing. They corresponded on an encrypted messenger that James had advised them to set up. On their last meeting before the forced break, James was unaccustomedly serious. "I'm thinking of telling David everything," he said. "We could go away, start a new life." Isabella was frightened. She wasn't ready for such a change. They quarreled for the first time in ages. She left in tears, and he remained standing on the veranda, clutching an unfinished glass of tequila. A week later, David announced his decision to run for city council. "Family values and tradition are our platform," he said at a press conference. James sat in the front row, applauding his son. Isabella watched them both, feeling the noose of lies tighten. October brought the first chill to Phoenix. Isabella and James resumed seeing each other, but something subtly changed. An uneasiness crept into their relationship. Every rustle made them flinch. Every unfamiliar car seemed like a stakeout. They talked more and more about the future, but their plans were like sandcastles, beautiful but ephemeral. One evening, Isabella found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside were pictures of her and James in different places, at different times. Attached to the pictures was a note. "I know everything." The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberately altered. She couldn't sleep that night, flinching at every sound in the big, empty house. James took the threat calmly. "I'll find a way to solve this problem," he said. His confidence was reassuring, but deep down, Isabella knew they had gone too far. The love that had seemed like salvation had turned into a deadly game. The denouement was approaching inexorably, like a hot wind heralding a storm in the desert. In the last week of October, a new gardener appeared at the Collins mansion. The silent, middle-aged man kept too close an eye on the house for a mere laborer. Isabella noticed him taking pictures of her car on his cell phone. When she told James about it, he grimaced. "Private detective, you need to be more careful." David suddenly became an attentive husband. He called several times a day, inquiring about his wife's plans, giving her flowers for no reason. At dinner, he asked about charity meetings. There was a strange gleam in his eyes, and a barely perceptible grin played on his lips. It was as if he knew something important, but he remained silent, enjoying his knowledge. One night, Isabella awoke to a sound in the study. David was sitting at his computer, looking through some files. Noticing his wife, he hastily closed the laptop. "Work stuff, dear. Sorry to wake you up." But she managed to spot the pictures of James's country house on the screen. Their last meeting with James had been permeated with anxiety. He looked aged, gaunt. "I wrote a letter to David," he admitted. "A father should apologize to his son. It is the right thing to do." Isabella begged him to wait, but the decision was made. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of betraying." That night they drank a special tequila, a rare variety that James had brought back from Oaxaca, a bitter flavor with notes of smoke and agave. "To the truth," he said, raising his glass. His hands trembled faintly. They made love one last time, desperately, as if anticipating trouble. James's body was found the next morning. He was lying in an armchair by the fireplace, an unfinished glass of tequila beside him. On the table, a sealed envelope with his son's name on it. Pathologist puts time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. The cause was cardiac arrest. David took the news of his father's death with a frightening calm. At the funeral, he kept aloof, mechanically accepted condolences. Isabella sobbed, not hiding grief. All wrote it off to attachment to her father-in-law. No one knew that in her purse was a final note from James. "I'm sorry for everything. I love you." The investigation began a week later. James's blood was found to contain traces of a rare poison. Police cordoned off the country house and seized a bottle of tequila and glasses. Detectives Sarah Bryant and Mike Torres began interviewing witnesses. They were particularly interested in who might have had access to the house on the night of the murder. Isabella remembered every detail of that evening. They'd parted around 11. She'd left first, leaving James in the living room with a bottle of tequila. She'd cried on the way home, anticipating the collapse of their secret world. But what awaited her in the morning was not a revealing scene with David, but the news of her lover's death. Investigators showed up at the mansion. They studied the financial records, interviewed the servants, and checked the security cameras. Detective Bryant was particularly interested in Maria's dismissal. "Strange coincidence," she remarked as she reviewed the former maid's statement. David spent a lot of time with lawyers, sorting out his father's inheritance. He took over as CEO of the company, continued his political campaign. "Life goes on," he said with the same odd smile. At night, Isabella could hear him pacing the office, muttering something to himself. James's letter to his son had disappeared. The police had found it neither in the house nor in the dead man's safe. Isabella knew that the letter held the key to unraveling what had happened, but she remained silent, paralyzed by fear and grief. At night, she dreamed of James holding out a glass of smoky tequila. "To the truth, my love, to the truth." Rumors spread through the town. Some brought up the strange death of James's first wife. Others hinted at the machinations of the company. Journalists dug deeper and deeper, trying to find the Collins family's dirty secrets. But the real secret was buried in Isabella's heart, along with her love for James. The detectives continued to investigate, unaware that the clue was closer than it seemed. The air smelled of death and betrayal, and clouds were gathering over Phoenix, heralding the first storm of fall. "More coffee, detective?" Sarah Bryant looked up from the photos. Lucy, a young waitress, held a coffee pot exuding the aroma of fresh Arabica. Joe's, a small diner on the outskirts of Phoenix, was empty. 3 a.m., the middle of the night, the middle of nowhere. "Thanks, sweetheart. And bring more toast." Crime scene photos spread fanning out on the worn tabletop. Perfectly cleaned room, expensive paintings on the walls. James Collins' corpse in the chair, like he was dozing off after a glass of tequila. Too neat, too theatrical. The bell over the entrance jingled. Mike Torres shook the raindrops off his leather jacket. A rare Arizona downpour had caught him on his way back from the lab. "I hate this weather," he muttered, plopping down across from Sarah. "It's like the whole town's died out. Just stray dogs and murderers," Sarah finished, sliding the folder with the toxicology report toward him. "What do you think?" Torres ran his eyes over the expert's report, whistled. "Plant poison, very rare. Used in rituals by Mexican shamans. Only available through certain channels in Oaxaca or Chiapas. Death occurs an hour to an hour and a half after ingestion. First euphoria, then paralysis of the respiratory system. The perfect murder weapon," Sarah smoked, blowing smoke into the ceiling. "The victim doesn't even realize he's dying, just falls asleep with a smile." Lucy brought toast and coffee for Torres. An old Sinatra song, "Strangers in the Night," was playing in the diner. Outside the window, rain was turning the desert into a swamp-like environment. "Let's get factual." Sarah pulled out a tattered notebook. "Time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning. Isabella Collins left the house at 11. Highway cameras confirm that. There were no other official visitors." "But there was an unofficial one." Torres sipped his coffee. "Take a look at this." He spread out David Collins's bank statements. The last 3 months of regular trips to San Diego had turned out to be a sham. Credit card transactions were recorded in Tijuana. What's a successful businessman doing in the slums of Tijuana? Sarah emphasized the dates. Particularly interesting this one, a payment at some drugstore 2 weeks ago. "Already checked." Torres nodded. "The apothecary specializes in folk medicine. The owner is a former shaman from Oaxaca, very taciturn." Morning found the detectives at the station. Sarah was reviewing Maria's former maid's statement for the 100th time. Something about this whole firing thing was bugging her. "Buenos dias, detectives." An elderly Mexican woman entered the interrogation room, thumbing her rosary beads. In a black dress, with her gray hair tucked into a bun, she resembled a stern nun. "Señora Maria," Sarah motioned her a glass of water. "Tell me again about the day you were fired." "La Señora Isabella said jewelry was missing." Maria pressed her lips together. "But that's a lie. I saw the way they looked at each other with Señor James, the way he touched her hand at dinner, how she put on a special perfume when he was at home." "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" Torres asked. "I didn't want to tarnish the memory of the dead." Maria crossed herself. "But there's something else. That day I found Señora Isabella's scarf in the country house. She was frightened. And a week later, I was fired." The phone rang in Sarah's office. Forensics had found something interesting at James's house. "Let's go," she nodded to Torres. "Thank you, Señora Maria. We may need your help again." The country house greeted them with yellow police tape and a forensics team. The October wind raced fallen leaves down the driveway. "What do you got?" Sarah pulled on latex gloves. "Signs of forced entry on the back door." The technician pointed to the barely visible scratches on the lock. "Professional work. And here's another thing." He shined an ultraviolet lamp on the window frame. A clear fingerprint showed up. "Already ran it through the database." The technician held out a clipboard. 99% match David Collins. Torres whistled. "Looks like our businessman isn't such a perfect son." In the living room, another technician was examining a bottle of tequila. "Detective Bryant, take a look at this. The cork has been replaced. Very neat, but you can see signs of resealing." Sarah examined the bottle. A rare variety, imported from Oaxaca. The label had an ornate inscription in Spanish. Someone switched the original drink with a poisoned one. She put on her glasses, scrutinizing the seal. Kept the factory packaging. Clever. "Detectives!" A shout from the street made them step out onto the veranda. A young policeman held up an evidence bag. "Found this in the dumpster behind the house. A check from a pharmacy in Tijuana." Sarah unfolded the crumpled check. The date was 2 weeks ago, blurred letters folded into the name of some kind of drug. "Torres, run that name through the database." She snapped a picture of the check. "And request the security footage from the gas station nearby. Someone must have stopped by here the night of the murder." The day was slowly slipping toward dusk. Phoenix was drowning in an orange haze when the detectives returned to the station. There was already a new folder on Sarah's desk, the results of the search of David Collins's office. "You need to see this!" Torres burst into the office, waving a flash drive. "Just got the footage from the gas station." Sarah turned on the monitor. The black and white footage showed a man in a cap and dark glasses buying gloves around midnight. Tall, broad-shouldered, distinctive gait. "Stop!" She pressed pause. "Zoom in on this one." A man was paying for a purchase. A bill flashed in his hands, a collector's edition with a special watermark. "I know that bill." Sarah reached for the evidence folder from David's office. "Here, look. Taken from his wallet during the search. It's a rare series, limited edition." "I'll call the gas station." Torres grabbed the phone. The cashier should memorize a bill like that. While her partner talked, Sarah immersed herself in perusing the contents of David's computer. The search history was eloquent. Rare poisons of Mexico, how to identify poisoning, symptoms of respiratory paralysis, forgery of suicide notes. Bingo! Torres hung up the phone. Cashier remembers this customer, says he haggled for the bill for a long time. The collector didn't want to part with it. And another detail, the man had a tattoo on his arm, a small one on his wrist. Sarah opened David Collins's file. Under special features was a tattoo of an R on his right wrist. "Robert," she whispered, the name of his dead uncle. There was a knock on the door. A young officer brought the results of the handwriting examination. "The suicide letter is a forgery." He held out the report. "Very good. But computer analysis showed a discrepancy with James Collins's handwriting samples." "Where did you find the real samples?" Sarah asked. "In old company documents. And here's something else interesting. The archives turned up the diary of Elizabeth Collins, James's first wife." Sarah opened the yellowed notebook. Neat, feminine handwriting, dates 15 years old. Her eyes widened more and more with each page. "Torres, did you know Elizabeth was originally the wife of Robert Collins, James's older brother?" "What?" He walked over to the table. "First I've heard." "It's all here." Sarah flipped through the pages. The affair between her and James, Robert's threats to reveal their connection, and then the mysterious car accident that killed Robert. A month later, James married his brother's widow. "History repeats itself," Torres muttered. "But now the son has avenged his father. Not just for the father." Sarah closed the journal. "For the mother, too. Elizabeth's last entry is dated the day she died. She was about to leave James, learned something about the death of her first husband." The captain came into the office. "Do you have enough for an arrest?" Sarah laid out the evidence. "Fingerprints at the crime scene, forged letter, evidence of a poison purchase in Tijuana, camera footage, a rare bill of sale, search history, and motive, double motive." Isabella's interrogation was decided to be held at her house. Reporters were already on duty outside the station, sensing a scoop. Sarah and Torres arrived at sunset. The Collins mansion loomed like a black silhouette against the purple sky. Isabella was waiting for them in the conservatory. Slim, in a black dress, she seemed a shadow of the gorgeous woman in the society photos. "Have you found the murderer?" Her voice trembled. "Tell me about last night," Sarah asked softly. "Every detail. James was strange." Isabella gripped the armrests of her chair. "Talked about forgiveness, about redemption. Showed an envelope with a letter for David. Wanted to tell his son everything about us, about his sins of the past." "What sins?" He didn't explain. Just said history must not repeat itself. She pulled out a handkerchief. "We were drinking a special tequila, a rare variety from Oaxaca. James used to say, 'To the truth, my love, to the truth.' His hands were shaking." Torres wrote down the statement. Darkness was thickening outside the windows, water gurgling in the fountain. "I left about 11 o'clock, Isabella continued. "He stayed in the chair by the fireplace, alive, warm. The next morning," she burst into tears. Sarah gave her time to calm down, then asked, "What do you know about Elizabeth Collins?" "Only that she died of cancer. David rarely talked about his mother." Isabella blotted her eyes. "But sometimes when he got drunk, he'd mumble strange things. That his father stole his mother. That the story should get a proper ending." Sarah's phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from the experts. The results of an analysis of Elizabeth's old medical records showed traces of the same poison that had killed James. "Where is your husband now?" Torres asked sharply. In the study. He's barely been out of there the last few days. David met them standing at the window. There was a bottle of whiskey on the table, papers burning in the fireplace. "You're late." He didn't turn around. "Father's letter is already burned. So was Mother's diary. We have copies." Sarah pulled out the handcuffs. "David Collins, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of James Collins. And Elizabeth Collins," Torres added. David laughed, hoarsely, fearfully. 15 years I've been waiting. Gathered evidence. Looked for that shaman in Oaxaca. My father took my mother away from me twice. First he took her away from Uncle Robert, then he killed her when she tried to escape. And now Isabella... History didn't repeat itself, Sarah said quietly. You rewrote it. Already in the car, Torres asked, "Do you think he really wanted justice? Or was he just crazy with jealousy?" Sarah watched the Collins mansion disappear in the rearview mirror. There are crimes of passion, Mike, and there are crimes of fate, when the past catches up with the present and the circle closes. Dawn was breaking over Phoenix. The city was waking up, unaware that one of its most high-profile dramas had come to an end. Waiting for them at the station was a mountain of paperwork, a press conference, and the closing of a case that had begun 15 years ago, with the mysterious death of a beautiful woman who dared to love another. "You know," Sarah said, lighting her last cigarette, "sometimes the truth really is worse than a lie." Torres nodded silently. Ahead of them was a new day and new mysteries of Phoenix, a city where passions burn as hot as the desert sun. A week after David Collins' arrest, Detective Sarah Bryant was sitting in Joe's diner again. In front of her lay a case file, ready to be filed away. But one question kept her on her mind. "Is something wrong?" Torres sank into a nearby chair, handing her a cup of coffee from the machine. "Remember the tequila analysis?" Sarah opened the toxicology report. The lethal dose was in the entire bottle. If Isabella really did drink with James that night, she should have died, Torres finished. "Do you think there's an inconsistency in the testimony?" "We need to talk to her again." Isabella Ramirez Collins was leaving Phoenix. Detectives caught her packing up the mansion to sell. Footsteps echoed resoundingly in the empty house. "I'm going back to Tijuana." She put the photos in a cardboard box. "There are too many ghosts here." "Senora Collins," Sarah sat down on the edge of the expensive sofa. "We need to clarify one point. That last night, did you really drink the same tequila as James?" Isabella froze. A tear rolled down her cheek. "No," she answered quietly. "James insisted I drink from a different bottle. Said this special tequila from Oaxaca was something he wanted to drink alone. To the truth, my love. To the truth. I even took offense." She sank into a chair, clutching a framed picture of James in her hands. "You know, sometimes I think he's figured it out. Saw something strange in the bottle or just sensed it. I mean, he knew David better than anyone, and he accepted his fate as redemption." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Torres asked. "I didn't give it much thought. Only later, when I found out about the poison, he saved my life that night, protected me one last time." Sarah looked out the window where the sun was setting behind the Arizona mountains. James Collins had chosen his end, didn't try to save himself, didn't call for help. Took the poison like communion, atoning for the sins of the past. "You know," Isabella stroked the photograph, "he once told me an old Indian legend about how some sins can only be atoned for by voluntary sacrifice. Maybe that night he finally found peace." The detectives left the mansion at dusk. The case was closed. David Collins confessed to the murders of his father and mother. Isabella was leaving for Mexico. The story came to an end. "Sometimes the simplest questions lead to the most complicated answers," Sarah said as she started the car. "And sometimes," Torres echoed, "love proves stronger than revenge." They pulled onto the highway. The Phoenix was dissolving into the night behind them, taking with it the secrets of the Collins family, the stories of love, betrayal, and redemption, woven into a pattern more complex than any ancient ornament on a bottle of tequila from Oaxaca. Epilogue, Mirrors of Truth. 3 years later, Detective Sarah Bryant retired. On her last day, she was sorting through old files and came across a folder of photos of the Collins family. There was a knock on the door. Standing on the doorstep was Mike Torres, now a captain with the Phoenix Police Department. "I knew I'd find you on this case," he smiled. "You know, David's lawyer came by yesterday. He killed himself in prison." Sarah nodded. She'd been waiting for this. Some knots could only be untied this way. "Left a letter." Torres placed the envelope on the table. "Addressed to both of us." In the letter, David admitted he'd lied on the stand. He hadn't killed Elizabeth. What's more, he hadn't planned to kill his father. The poison was meant for himself. "That night I came to explain myself to my father," he wrote. "I wanted to tell him that I knew everything, about him and Isabella, about my mother and Uncle Robert. Brought a bottle of poison. I thought I would drink myself, in front of him. My son's last revenge. But when I saw him sitting in the chair, so smug, so confident, something clicked. I switched the bottles. Didn't even think about it, just did it." "Shit," Torres exhaled. "And here we were building a whole theory about a carefully planned revenge." Sarah pulled another letter out of her desk drawer, one from Isabella sent a year ago from Mexico City. "I lied to you then. James didn't offer me another tequila. I didn't drink it myself. For the first time in a long time, I listened to my intuition. There was something wrong in his eyes, in his words about the truth. He knew the bottle was poisoned, knew it was David's and accepted it as atonement. So all three knew." Torres shook his head. "Everyone played their part in the play, and we were trying to find logic where there was only doom." Sarah walked over to the window. Phoenix was drowning in the sunset glow. "You know what the worst part of this story is? Not the poison, not the betrayal, not the revenge. It's that they all loved each other, for real. James loved his son, so he accepted death. David loved his father, so killing him broke him. Isabella loved them both. That's why she left without telling the truth." "And the truth?" "And the truth, Mike, is always the same." Sarah picked up her bag, ready to leave the office for good. "We see in others only a reflection of our own sins, and redemption often doesn't come the way we plan." They stepped out into the sweltering evening. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. A thunderstorm rare for Arizona was coming. "Have a tequila with me?" Torres offered. "To closing the last case." "To the truth," Sarah nodded. They didn't know that at this very moment, in a small church in Tijuana, Isabella Ramirez was placing candles for the repose of both men she loved. The truth had finally found peace. In David's confession, in Isabella's prayers, in the dusty archives of the Phoenix police station. And the city lived on, keeping in its fiery memory the story of love and death dancing their last tango to the sound of a distant thunderstorm.